Hi, I'm Fred Long. Welcome to another installment of Greek Matters. We're going to turn our attention to Ephesians in this edition, particularly 4:31 and 32. Now, these verses fall within the beginning section of Paul's admonitions, where he in earnest talks to the Ephesians and really, I think, all believers in Asia Minor. I think this was a circular letter. He begins talking about how they need to live in light of Christ. And particularly in verses 25 through 32, he gives a series of commands. Now, this list in verse 31 has always been of interest to me, and the more I've reflected on it, the more I realize how profound it is. And particularly, even more profound is verse 32, which would seem to provide the solution to the problem of verse 31. So let's look at these verses more carefully. We see in verse 31 polysyndeton, that is, a list of items that are separated by individual kes, which means and. All bitterness and rage and anger and shouting and blasphemy or slander, put aside, be removed from you with all evil. So as I study this, each individual item is stressed because of the presence of the kes. Each one of these kes essentially tees up the item to be individually in focus. When studying lists, I like to always consider, is there a development, a meaningful development from one element to the next? Does it build climactically? Is there a move from inner to outer? In my Koine Greek Grammar textbook, I discuss how to study lists. Well, here we have a vice list in terms of its content, and Paul is urging them to get rid of it. Well, what we see as we go to my put this Greek text into a Word document is that each of these is set off by ke, and then you have the verb, and then two prepositional statements, from you and with all evil, along with all evil. This list, as I think about it, really is going from inner realities, bitterness, through an internal process to outward manifestation, to then eventually slander. And so bitterness is where it begins. Bitterness is resentment, and resentment is resentiment, which means re-feeling the offense. And so this is where Paul says it begins. It begins with bad feeling that we obtain by reliving injury, resentiment, resentment, and bitterness. So we get rid of all of that bitterness. And then what follows is a cascade of further escalation. So thumos and orge are two words which we might think as synonymous, as being very similar in meaning. But there is a slight difference. If we go to BDAG, thumos is an intense expression of the inner self. It is more interior. It builds directly off of bitterness. And then when we go to orge is also can be internal, but it also reflects a strong feeling directed at wrongdoing with a focus on retribution. So when we move from thumos to orge, there is a move from inner to outer retribution. And so orge is often seen in terms of actions. Now, in the context of this list, there's a further escalation. Kravge. Kravge is shouting or fighting. And it's a clamor. It can be translated as clamor. But really, at this point, the anger has manifested itself in an outward expression of shouting. Now, presumably, the shouting is at the person who offended us or who hurt us. And so the anger is no longer inside, but it expresses itself outwardly towards the person with whom we're angry. But it doesn't stop there. In fact, we go next to blasphemy or slander. Now, this word what it involves is talking about the person that we're angry with another. So at this point, our anger, our bitterness has grown to not only shouting at the offender, but also speaking ill or badly of the offender to someone else. We're now infecting other people. We're triangulating our anger and involving other people in slandering of the person with whom we're angry. If this isn't bad enough, it gets even worse, because the end of the list is set off with a prepositional phrase, and this with all evil or malice. I do like that translation, malice, which is found in the NASB, helps to convey the idea that along with this movement from bitterness to shouting, to anger, to shouting, to slander, there is a sense of all evil. At this point, all evil becomes a part of our modus operandi, so to speak. We want to act in such a way to bring about all evil. This is not a good state of affairs. This is bad for us as human beings. And so this list, which might at first glance just seem to be avoid these things, actually upon closer inspection is a diagnosis of the problem that begins with bitterness and leads to a state of wanting all evil, all malice towards those involved. Well, how do we fix this? I mean, Paul says don't do this, but actually in verse 32 we actually get the antidote, the remedy for this kind of expression of anger. He says in verse 32, become compassionate or kind to one another rather. So yeneste is a command form, and it means to become. So become kind. Christi is the adjective, what we're supposed to become. Be kind towards one another. Now, this pronoun, allelus, is a reciprocal pronoun, and so this is something that we're supposed to be doing towards one another. I do it towards you, you do it towards me, we do it towards everybody, one another. We belong together. So this is very significant. Also, Paul urges compassion, being well compassionate towards one another. Now, this adjective is related to the verb form that the gospel writers use of Jesus, that he sees the crowd and has compassion on them. So this word has a deep rootedness probably in the tradition surrounding Jesus and how to be compassionate. And so this is being Christ-like himself. And then we have forgiving each other. That's often how it's translated, forgiving each other. But in fact, if we look at this pronoun, ev avtis, we see that it's a reflexive pronoun. And so a more accurate translation, and I think this is what Paul is in fact intending, is forgiving yourselves. Now, forgiving ourselves sometimes can be the hardest thing, but it seems to be related to our capacity then to have compassion and even express kindness towards one another. Somehow, if we don't forgive ourselves, we're bottling ourselves up. And perhaps we're holding ourselves to a certain kind of standard, and we're beating ourselves up about it, we're uptight about it. Well, guess what? If we don't forgive ourselves, and we're uptight with ourselves and unforgiving, well, we're going to be unforgiving and not compassionate towards other people. So once again, we have a list here, and there seems to be a rhyme to its reason, a reason to its rhyme, so to speak. And then finally, we see the real basis, what even allows forgiving ourselves and being compassionate and kind, what even makes that possible, is seen in this kathos clause. Now, this kathos clause indicates support, that is substantiation, as well as comparison. So this kind of clause I call a correspondence clause because it provides a basis and a kind of comparison for us in our actions. And so Paul says, just as also God in Christ forgave you. That's the foundation. That's where it all begins, is God's forgiveness of us is the basis for and a comparison for us in terms of how we relate to ourselves, forgiving ourselves, and then having compassion, and then being kind to one another. So in my notes here, I have a little diagram just kind of showing this development from just as God has forgiven you, backwards forgiving yourselves, and then having compassion and kindness. This is the antidote. This is what allows us to, in fact, get rid of all bitterness and all malice. The basis of that is God's forgiveness of us, our forgiveness of ourselves, which then allows us to be compassionate and then kind towards one another. And I have a few notes here that you can pause and read in this. Well, thanks for joining me in this edition of Greek Matters. I hope to see you next time.